So hello and welcome to this conversation with Kim Biddulph, who's the Public Programmes Projects Manager at City of London Police Museum, Paul Bickley, who's the Crime Museum Curator at Metropolitan Police Service, and I will be in the chair asking some questions. My name is Clare Smith. I'm the Historic Collection Curator at the Metropolitan Police. So Kim, we slightly outnumber you, but I promise to be completely fair. I thought the good start would be just to have a chat about why there are two police forces in London.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So I work at the City of London Police Museum. So the City of London Police is a very small police force in the centre of London, and it's always been separate to the Metropolitan Police ever since they were set up in the 19th century. Talk about from time.
Yeah, I mean, all around the country, they've tried to slimline forces by joining various forces together to make bigger forces. And the City of London sometimes has come under fire, but clearly it has its own value, very special in the city, that it's always been recognised as a need for the two forces to coexist.
Yeah, I mean, I was looking at some of the shenanigans around setting up both of the services in the 1820s and 30s, and there was an outcry by the City of London Corporation at the idea that an external group could police their little area, and they appealed to the Queen in 1839, and eventually they got their own professional police force. One of the things that they said, though, was that they had had police for hundreds of years, and they didn't need this new police force because they had the watch, but you know, the Metropolitan Police being there kind of forced them to really professionalise the watch, which had already been happening anyway beforehand. But yeah, so there you go. It is still separate, still, and that, you know, the City of London is a bit different to the rest of London, isn't it? Because it's got a lot of financial institutions and banks. So the City of London Police are the national lead for fraud, for instance, and there's very few residents in the city as well.
I was quite fascinated to find out how few people live in the city, and in a normal, obviously not in 2020, but in a normal year, how many people come in every day to the City of London. And I think you're right, that's very different for the Met, tending to be covering areas of London which are high residential numbers, different type of thing, and as you say, the specialism of fraud and financial crime. But I think, you know, nice that we can all work together. And
absolutely, and the two forces do work together very frequently, you know. So
as an officer, we used to sort of make sure we knew our local community, and the point you raised about the city not having local residents always used to amuse us when they had city officers come into areas to do searches, because most of the criminals working in the City of London didn't live there, did they? They would come out to other areas. So we made a point as Met officers to make sure we knew the local towns, which made working in the city so much different.
Yeah, it's a little bit more difficult. They do obviously try and get to know. Sorry, Paul, go on.
Yeah, but people travel in from north, east, south and west, whereas if you worked South London, you probably deal mainly with South London criminals, so you could get to know your criminals. So the city was very much more of a challenge.
Yeah. I mean, obviously they get to know the businesses really well, but yeah, and there is of course a lot of white collar crime that they can be investigating. But I mean, we're going to be talking together about one of the big cases where the two forces came together and worked together really well. And I'm going to take the first half, and then in the second video, Paul, you're going to talk about the second half, which kind of happened on the Met's patch, didn't it?
This case is really great in terms of not only showing how we have a shared history of crime in London, but showing the difference of why one crime is committed in the City of London ground, and then the next thing that happens is Metropolitan Police London ground. Everybody comes together to solve this case, and that's why as police museums we've come together to talk about this case. So I feel like we're carrying forward that spirit of cooperation from these earlier crimes.
Yeah, and Paul's right that, you know, you get the criminals who committed this crime didn't live in the city, they lived in the East End, and so that, you know, you have to come together to work on it. Absolutely.
So is
And
that
we
a good
still do
point
that
for us?
today, yeah. So it's very good to go.
Kim, could you tell us a bit about the Houndsditch Murders, the first part of this story?
I can indeed. Let me just set up my slideshow then, because I'm going to show you a few things. Yeah, so this is something that happened, hopefully you can see that now, in 1910. And so it's quite a long time ago now. It's in the Edwardian era, and it happened in this area of London here. And these maps is from a great site hosted by the National Library of Scotland, where they put old maps and new maps next to each other, so you can kind of see the change. And I'm absolutely fascinated by these maps. I look at it a lot. So it's known as, this case, as the Handstitch Murders, although it's got a much more famous second half at the Siege of Sidney Street, which I'm sure you've probably heard of. And we'll go into why that's I think in Paul's video. But Houndsditch is where it all started, but it wasn't actually Houndsditch. You can see Houndsditch there, which is on the line of the old Roman wall of the City of London, and Houndsditch is there now. You can see that road, and this road is no longer as busy. It's kind of been diverted there. But it's not really in Houndsditch that this happened. It was in Exchange Buildings. So on the old map, you can see there's Houndsditch, there's Cutler Street, which is important, and then there's Exchange Buildings there, and it's a little cul-de-sac. And they were residential houses at that point. If you look now, you can see there's Cutler Street, and there's no Exchange Buildings anymore. They're all big buildings. I think the front of this one is actually a Starbucks now, on Houndsditch. All happened. On the night of December the 16th, 1910, a man called Max Weil, who lived in Houndsditch, probably at one of these buildings, I haven't quite worked out which one it was, 120 Houndsditch, came home, and his sister told him, there's been some terrible noises at the back, it sounds like drilling. So Max went and had a listen. Now, of course, you couldn't dial 999 at that point, so what you did is you waited in the street for the officer to come around on the beat. And he came across PC Piper, who came into his house and had a listen. And then he was advised to go round to Exchange Buildings. And I think Hattie told him that there were some foreigners living there. So she was a little bit suspicious of them. He went round, and they determined that it was probably coming from 11 Exchange Buildings. So he knocked, and it was opened. And in his deposition later, he said that he asked the man who opened it, who had a long pale face, is the missus in? And he just got the answer no. So in order not to raise their suspicions too much more, PC Piper says, okay, I'll call back later, and left. So he went to get backup because he was suspicious, and someone else took over basically this whole kind of event at that point, Sergeant Robert Bentley. But there were a load of them. Bentley got together quite a team of about 7 or 8 officers. Weil's house, listened to them, then went back round to 11 Exchange Buildings. Now, these officers of the City of London Police were not armed in any way, apart from their truncheons. They weren't expecting any real violence. What they were expecting was to catch some people in the act of breaking into a jeweller's. The house next door, the building next door to Max Weil's house, was a jewellery shop, and that's what everybody assumed these people were trying to get into. So they were very surprised when Robert Bentley knocked on the door, asked, "Is someone doing some drilling?" And he went in, and the next thing that happened was he fell backwards out through the door, having been shot. The shooter then stuck his hand out of the door and kept on shooting, and several other people got shot, including Sergeant Tucker, Sergeant Woodhams, and Sergeant Bryant. And then the shooter, so everything was in uproar, and the shooter came out, and he was tackled by one of the constables, Constable Choate, who grabbed hold of this man with a pale face, but then at least one, maybe two others came out of the building. A friend get away. They shot Choate, but they accidentally shot their friend in the back as well. And then they got away. And the police were obviously in disarray because they were not expecting these burglars to be so well armed. And you know, one of the police officers was clearly dead. That was Sergeant Tucker. Sergeant Bentley and Constable Choate were in a really bad way, and they were taken to hospital, as were Woodhams and Bryant. So Sergeant Tucker, Sergeant Bentley, and Constable Choate sadly all died from their wounds. Luckily, Sergeant Woodhams and Bryant both survived, although I think they were both discharged from the police. So it was a huge thing for the police. It was actually the biggest loss of life in one incident that the police had, city police had at that point.
Yeah.
And in fact, I think it still is.
Yeah,
I think probably is. I mean, it's such a horrendous incident, and something you can't really legislate for, expect, is it?
No, not at all.
Fighting like that, even today's date, that would cause a massive problem to anyone turning up to a crime scene.
Yeah, it is such a shocking level of violence. It must have been, it's shocking for the police, but also for the public. They must have been quite horrified that this had happened in this sort of residential street in the City of London.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there were people in all of the buildings around. Obviously, the police had thought about evacuating the area because, you know, they didn't have any idea that these men were armed. So there were bullets found by Miss Parker over in 2 Exchange buildings across the road. It went through her front door, you know. There was a boy of 14 who was watching the whole thing from his window next door at 12 Exchange buildings, Solomon Abrahams. So, yeah, I mean, they were vital witnesses as well, but they were obviously, they saw quite this whole thing happen in front of them. Actually one of the next things that happened, well, we think that happened, just as I keep this map on, I'm going to show you. Apparently a man called Isaac Levy, and I've only seen this in the trial transcript, he was coming home that night from Liverpool Street Station, which is just up here, if you can see my cursor, hopefully. And he was coming
top left.
Can you see it?
Yep.
Yeah.
Great. He was coming through Devonshire Square, and then through this passage here. This is here, but at that point he called it Borer's Passage, and he came down Borer's Passage, and that's when apparently he encountered 3 people, well, no, actually 4 people. One man being carried between 2 others, who were brandishing guns, and they told him to just go past, and otherwise they'd shoot him. And there was a woman trailing behind them. So he became quite an important witness, but whether or not he was actually accurate in what he saw is another matter. Anyway, so he saw that, and then he went down Cutler Street. Although his house was actually this way on Golston Street, but he went down Cutler Street and saw the devastation here, and then ran round the corner to Bishopsgate Police Station, which is kind of over here, to tell them that some police were injured, and he'd heard some shooting apparently as well.
And of course, this is, pre-radios, no way of communicating to the station that this has happened.
Yep.
So yeah, you're relying on people to go
armed
and
response
tell
vehicles to come
Bishopsgate.
rush into the scene. You've got officers being shot, and you haven't got armed response vehicles who can rush to the scene. So even though they're aware of it, they've got a big problem, haven't they?
They do.
People police officers.
Yeah. The police had, the city police had just got some electric ambulances, so they were the ambulance service, and one of them was kept at Bishopsgate, which I assume was used. But I know that the first person to be got taken to hospital was Sergeant Tucker, and they just commandeered someone's car that was driving past down Houndsditch, and took him to the hospital. So. Yeah, quite a thing. They would just have to run back and forth to Bishopsgate to get help, basically. So moving on. Later that night, then, of course, the investigation started, and it was it was led by Detective Superintendent John Ottaway. And these are a couple of the things that he found at the scene. They're in our museum now, in the City of London Police Museum, and when we reopen, you can come and see them. Up on the top left is a gas canister. So this was filled with oxygen, and with it there was some rubber tubing and drill bits attached. So this was being used to drill through the wall. And he'd found that there was quite a lot of bricks and brick dust and brick fragments actually behind 9 exchange buildings, because they'd gone into they'd kind of gone through the yards behind the buildings into 9 exchange buildings. There were tools as well. He also decided to take this lock. It looked like it had been newly attached to it was 9 exchange buildings actually, and it was given to a locksmith to examine, which showed that the people had in the houses had put this on so that their landlord couldn't come in and surprise them. The key was only held by the people in the gang. So those were found. Of course, bullets were found as well. Actually, this bullet here was found at Sidney Street, apparently, but there were just stray bullets found at random times in the buildings, across the street, in the road itself, down the end at Cutler Street.
Kim, what does the envelope say about the bullet found at Sidney Street? Does it say it was a suspect bullet or a soldier's bullet?
Oh, that's a good question. So it was found on the right side of, I have it at 109 Sidney Street. So it was across the road from Sidney, from 100 Sidney Street. So it was from
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Paul.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, please do. That's great.
Just my thinking was obviously the suspect's bullets wouldn't be inside 100 Sidney Street, which makes sense. It would be in 109. Yeah,
exactly. The bottles on the right are actually kind of little bottles that were used in the postmortems of a couple of the men who were killed. So there's a bullet from Choate and from Tucker, but the little one, we can't read the label anymore, so we don't know who that's from. But we do have the postmortem reports, which worked out, what angles and the bullets went into the men and so on. They're horrible to read. But obviously they were doing really good in a similar way to a postmortem would be conducted today, probably with slightly less accuracy, because there's no kind of images, there's no diagrams, but there's just a written report, so it's open to a bit more interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
And then
elements in forensics obviously forensics have assisted the post-mortem a lot more today than they had at that stage as well. So very challenging for them at that time.
Very challenging.
They had available.
And I guess that the crime scene being the street, so it's a really difficult to manage that. You've obviously had to move people out because you want to take them to hospital. So it's really chaotic for them to try and manage.
Yeah, very chaotic, and a lot of things had been moved. Some of the bullets were given in by members of the public. Some of them were found by police who were on duty there several days later. You know, it wasn't done in the same way as it would be today, because they hadn't developed that yet.
No.
This is actually not a live gun, but it is a 3D cast, 3D printed version of the gun that was found on the man with the pale face, who was finally found. And he was found because he'd been taken to 59 Grove Road in the East End by his friends and left there. And then two women who lived at 59 Grove Road with a couple of the men in the gang on and off, called a doctor, Dr. Scanlon. And Dr. Scanlon did attend to this man, who the ladies called George Gardstein. And then he left, and he said, I'll come back in the morning, see how he is. And he went back in the morning. The women had gone, the body was still there, and George Gardstein was dead. So at that point, he called not the police, but the coroner, and it was finally the coroner who got the city police involved. So the police were at 59 Grove Road by 1 p.m. And they found his coat with a bullet hole in it, and they found loads of bits and pieces in his house, which were quite useful. And there was a ballistics report as well, which I found really interesting. So this is from Ernest Goodwin, who was in the city police, and he basically identified the bullet from PC Choate's leg was fired from a Mauser, and this gun here is a Mauser. It was a semi-automatic weapon, and it was used by the German military at the time. Of course, it was famously used in the First World War, so it's a really high quality firearm. And he tried to match up some of the other bullets from exchange buildings, and saying that he thinks he could with some, and he did actually do some experimental firing of the gun to check whether the marks were the same. So they were really getting into that really good ballistics research, which I think is fantastic. He also identified some of the bullets as being from Brownings.
Was there a Dreiser there as well?
Oh yeah, no. They also found loads of cartridges and things like that in the various places that they came across, because they had a name for this guy who they'd found, but obviously they were trying to trace the rest of the gang as well. So that's where they really rely quite a lot on luck, actually.
Good police work is sometimes regarded as luck, isn't it? When you catch people, they say you were so lucky, but you make your own luck. If you don't ask the questions, if you don't look in the right places, you don't make your own luck.
Yeah, this is true. But I'll tell you some stories about that in a minute. One of the things that is really amazing about this case is that it's one of the very early uses of fingerprinting. So for the city police, I mean, obviously fingerprinting was developed and really applied by the Met at the fingerprint department at New Scotland Yard, and the city didn't have their own fingerprint department, so they went to Charles Collins at the Met to help with this. He actually was called in on the 17th of December, apparently, according to his report, by Superintendent Ottaway, to go to 11 exchange buildings, and they'd found a couple of bottles in a cupboard, and they had initially not thought that they were of any use. They're just being kind of domestic items, but then they realized that there were some marks on them that could be of use with this new technology of doing fingerprints. So he went and took those fingerprints. But of course, there is then the problem that you don't have a fingerprint database to check any of your fingerprints against. You just have fingerprints.
Absolutely, and I suppose the fact that the scene was the crime scene of the house was interrupted because the police arrived. So the gang run away, leaving everything. So we know that's how you trace the ammunition and the fingerprints, and in a way, it's the perfect sort of crime scene, isn't it? Because there's been no attempt to clean up after themselves. They've just gone.
Yeah, because they were interrupted mid burglary. Yeah.
As you say, fingerprints was still very much in its infancy, wasn't it? So although we were using it for a while before that, criminals didn't consider fingerprints in the way modern criminals would. Still more careless, and they would leave more fingerprints for us to find at that time.
Yeah, definitely not so aware. I think actually this is only this, as far as I've been able to find out, it was only the second time that fingerprints were used in a case, or at least in a case that was taken to a trial at the City of London Police. So really, really interesting. But the problem was for them, of course, they had these fingerprints. They could check them against the body that they had of George Gardstein, and they weren't his. But then they had to still find other suspects in order to check the fingerprints against them to prove that they were there. So that was the big job. One of the other things that happened was when they found George Gardstein and they found his body, in those rooms where they found him, there was quite a lot of literature in different languages, in Russian, German, I think some Dutch as well, and a lot of it was anarchist in nature. So, of course, in kind of that Edwardian period, there were around Europe, Eastern Europe, and in Russia, there were a few groups that were agitating for revolution and had wider anarchist aims in other countries as well. There was some anarchism in Italy, for instance, where they're basically just protesting against the government. But there were strains of anarchism where they were called a legalism, where they kind of challenged the rule of law generally. And however, it was thought that possibly because of this anarchist literature, that the people who were doing this, who were committing this burglary, were trying to do it to raise funds in order to fund a terrorist campaign.
And
so
they were very organised, weren't they, the gang? Because, as they found the tools, they changed the locks. They were obviously, quite professional in the way they were going about this.
They were. It was quite interesting because there's literature that was found in George Gardstein's rooms, which were actually eventually they put out a poster, and I know you're going to talk about the poster later, Paul, but they're asking for information, and George Gardstein's landlord came forward and said that he lived at his house. So he didn't live at 59 Grove Road, he lived at 44 Gold Street. And there were there was literature in his house, in his rooms, basically saying how to eat through metal, presumably to get into a safe, and how to create explosives and things like that. So this really just bolstered the police's perception that these men who were committing this crime were more than just burglars, that they might be terrorists. So the commissioner, William Knockbauer, wrote to the very famous Macnaughton at the Metropolitan Police, and he was working. Of course, you heard his name probably if you've done any reading about the Whitechapel murders. But at this point, he was working for Special Branch, and Knockbauer's asked Macnaughton to do some some investigation into whether or not these people who were involved in the case were actually possibly some Eastern European terrorists. And I found this letter that was sent from Macnaghten back to Knockbauer after having done some work. So you can see it's later in January in 1911 that he sent this, and it basically says that there is a group of, can you see it says a group of Lets? Now that means Latvians. It was a different word for them at the time. Latvia at the time wasn't independent. It was part of the Russian Empire. And there was a group called Liesma, which meant flame, of anarchists who were trying to get independence for Latvia. But he's kind of talked to, or through his channels, whatever they were, quite mysterious channels, managed to get some information about what these groups were saying, and they were saying that want anything to do with them, that they were just there's no sympathy with the murderers from anarchists here or from the chief anarchist centres on the continent.
And it's so wonderfully of its time, isn't it? That foreign anarchists are over there on the continent. The chief ones said
we don't have homegrown anarchists.
Yeah, of course not.
And that it was just for plunder and robbery for personal gain. So I found this quite interesting, that's what they concluded, because the other thing is that a famous Italian anarchist called Enrico Malatesta was the one who supplied the oxygen cylinder. And when you look at if you compare the statement he gave to the police about supplying this cylinder and the statement he said in court, they're completely different. And he had been exiled he'd run away from Italy for his crimes as an anarchist. So it's kind of could go either way, really. They could maybe have been out for personal gain, but maybe Macnaghten didn't ask the right people. I don't know.
Yeah, the information might not be good enough. Or maybe the anarchists didn't want to be too truthful, did they? Highly likely to say, or unlikely to say, oh yes, this is us and we're financing our campaign with crime, are they? So difficult to know, really.
It is difficult to know. I mean, as I say, some of them were perfectly happy with this idea that laws didn't apply and could be broken at any moment, but maybe killing 3 police officers was too much. I don't know. There is also some discussion, they talk to the Russian embassy and get some information on some of the gang, which hopefully I should be able to tell you about in a second. There we go. So it's quite interesting because there are a number of breakthroughs and how they actually round up these people. So whilst they're at 59 Grove Road, one of the guys just turns up. Is not here actually in these pictures because they decided he wasn't part of it. But he was called Nikolai Tokmakov, and he knocked on the door and says, "Hello, is Fritz in?" And he was there to pick up a mandolin that Fritz had been fixing for him, apparently. And so the police invited him in and said, no, he's not here, but come and talk to us.
Yeah, we like a word.
Quite useful. He was able to tell them quite a lot about who lived at 59 Grove Road and who they all kind of associated with. Also, when the police turned up to 59 Grove Road, they did actually find a woman, not this woman, but Rosa Trashonsky, who could also tell them quite a lot about different people. And so they learned about people, not their entire names, and everybody seems to have gone by aliases a lot of the time. So there was the barber, who ended up being this guy, who is John Rosen. There was Fritz and Joseph, who we'll come across later, I think, in Paul's talk. There was Peter, and it's unsure whether that's the famous Peter the Painter, who we'll also talk about later, or Jacob Peters, who is actually on the next slide here. That's Jacob Peters. And various other people. So this guy here with the big moustache is called Fedorov, and this guy here is Yurka Dubov. And I love Yurka's story at the most, I think. So the police put out call for information about Yurka. They only had a first name, and Yurka is a very, very common Russian name because it's Russian for George. Because there were a lot of Russian refugees in London, there were so many Yurkas. So George Mumford, who was a reporter, was told by his editor to go and just look up all of the Yurkas and go to their house and talk to them. And he managed to find this Yurka called Yurka Duboff, and he went to 22 Galloway Road in Shepherd's Bush, and he knocked on the door, and the landlady answered, and she says, "Oh yes, we heard they were looking for a Yorker, but it's not our Yorker." And then he went in and he talked to Yorker. It was from the Evening News, and he wrote it up for the paper the next day. And the following day, he got a call. George Mumford, the reporter, got a call from the city police saying, "Who's that guy? Can we go and talk to him?" And they because he was the Yurka that was mentioned on some of the documents, and he'd actually painted. There was a painting of his signed by him at 59 Grove Road. So this is how I just love that story about how they managed to find him and pick him up.
Yeah.
And then there's the lady there, Nina. And Nina Vasileva, it's confusing because she says at one point that she was Fritz's girlfriend. She says she was Joseph's girlfriend. Other people say she was George Gardstein's girlfriend. So they're obviously covering stuff up all the time. But she was picked up at Sidney Street. She'd obviously possibly gone there after the big siege for sentimental reasons, but she also believed that she was being followed all the time. She got very later on you can read in her landlady's statement that the landlady says that Nina told her she was being followed, so it might have been that just eventually they decided to pick her up. So she was picked up in February. And that's where taking those fingerprints really came in handy, because they ended up being hers after she had said she hadn't been at 11 Exchange Buildings. So she was put on trial. So that's
a great breakthrough for the police to be able to confirm through fingerprints that she was in that room. Yes,
absolutely. So we're gonna kind of jump forward a little bit just because I love this model. It's like the kind of CSI digital model of the crime scene, except it's made out of wood and glue, and it was made by the police carpenter for the city, George Bayliss.
I love it. It's like a really macabre Gothic doll's house.
Yes, it is. Yeah, I think
as a child I would have loved this.
Oh, I know, it's amazing. And you've got 11 Exchange Buildings here, 10 and 9, and you have the back, and you can just see behind here. These are Max Vile's house and the jeweller's shop that belonged to Samuel Harris at the back there, so that the jury could be shown exactly where everything happened. Although they were actually taken to Exchange Buildings to have a look at the crime scene as well, which again feels like something that you would do in a today. So another kind of quite modern idea. But they did also have the model, which I love.
Yeah, the model is great, isn't it? So today's date, we can still see the crime scene through this model. It's fantastic.
Yeah, I know, it's great. But I'm going to end by remembering again the police officers who died. So this is a card that a lot of people, I think, bought in order to remember the 3 officers who were killed. There was quite a public outcry about it. There was lots of discussion about whether or not police should be armed and stuff like that in order to protect themselves.
Generally, isn't there? After an incident like this, there's always call for
it always happens, yeah.
Better guns, bigger guns, more guns.
Yeah. There was a big funeral at St Paul's and the route of the coffins was lined by thousands of people. Sergeant Charles Tucker, he was known as, his first name was actually Thomas, but not that that matters. Well, it does matter. He was 46. He was the officer who died at the scene. He was married with 2 children, and he had actually he was supposed to have retired in 1910 with a pension, but he was asked to stay on. Well, he asked to stay on so that he could be at the coronation of George V, which was due to happen in June of 1911, that he never got to. So, I mean, obviously all stories are sad. But, Constable Choate, Walter Choate, had joined the force in 1897. He was 34. He was single, and he actually lived at Bishopsgate in the unmarried quarters. And he was the one who had caught hold of Guardsdean and had tried to catch him, but had been shot whilst doing that. And Sergeant Bentley, Robert Bentley, had joined the police in 1898, and he was 36 when he was killed. He was a very young sergeant for the time. His wife was pregnant when he died, as she'd managed to be at his side when he died, and she gave birth to their second child several days after his death. All of the men received King's Police medals for their bravery, and the widows of the 2 dead sergeants were given 30 shillings a week for life as a pension as well. This memorial here on the right was up in Bishopsgate Police Station to them for many, many years. So I think I'll end there.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's, you know, it's so dramatic and so chaotic, and there's so many forensics to talk about. But I think at the end, it is thinking about the 3 officers who lost their lives, who were just doing their job, or going to what they assumed was a routine burglary, and walk into this, which they couldn't possibly have foreseen.
Yep. And you can imagine how emotional doing the investigation would be afterwards as well, having lost these colleagues.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you for telling us about the Houndsditch murders, because they are really part 1 of a 2-part story. And when we come back, Paul is going to tell us what happened next in this very dramatic story, which is the Siege of Sidney Street. So thank you very much, Kim.
Thank you.